Hello, I am Tammy Marshall, and welcome to my channel. And today I'm going to share with you the third chapter in my third novel called Ticker Tape. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to listen to the first two chapters, you may want to go back and listen to those first. But this is chapter 3 in Ticker Tape, which is about a Vietnam veteran named Marvin Wineski who's kind of washed up and broken and takes place in the main action takes place like in the late 80s. But the chapter I'm going to read to you actually takes place in 1972. So, ticker tape Marvin, North Vietnam, October 19th, 1972. Marvin lay face down in a field, his parachute trailing on the ground behind him, fluttering aloft in the wind. He was unconscious, which might explain why he wasn't executed on the spot by the men who found him. After they kicked him a few times, Marvin finally stirred and instinctively made a move to rise. The nearest man pushed him back down with a mud caked boot. As the foreign voices filled his ears, Marvin realized he was in trouble. So he complied with his captors and remained prone. The men tugged at his harness and then resorted to cutting it loose. Marvin held his breath, expecting at any moment to feel the slice of a machete against his skin. But once they had the harness off him, they pulled him roughly to his feet. That's when Marvin realized he had an even bigger problem. His legs buckled under him, and he fell to the ground, pulling one of the angry men down with him. He heard what he could only imagine was heavy cursing in the native language, and then the men grabbed him once more and hauled him to his feet. Again his legs gave way, and he began to fall, but this time the men held him up and dragged him toward a waiting truck. The young driver scrambled out and hurried to the back to pull down the tailgate. Then the two men supporting Marvin lifted him and threw him into the truck bed. As Marvin fell face first onto the planks, he noticed his hands. His right one was fine, but his left was charred and missing 2.5 fingers. Then and only then did Marvin really begin to panic. He felt the truck shift into gear and he tried to roll over to get a feel for where he was or where he was headed. But between his broken body's uncooperative response to his brain's signal and the boot of his nearest captor pushing his head into the floorboards, Marvin found his attempts at movement to be lessons in futility. Instead, he forced himself to relax as much as possible and focus on what he could hear and the passage of time. His mind began to reel, though, playing and replaying the scenes from earlier in the day. He'd awakened at first light, rolled out of his cot, and roused his pilot, Larry McDonald, a man a few months his junior, but ostensibly years more mature than Marvin due to his more extensive war experience. Marvin and the rest of the men in their unit called Larry Mighty Mac, due to both his prowess at the controls of his F-4E Phantom II fighter jet and to the prowess he exhibited with the local ladies who flocked around the American GIs whenever they went to town to relieve the stress brought on by dropping bombs on towns full of innocent people. Mighty Mac grumbled into his pillow at Marvin's shoulder shake, but he woke enough to roll over and squint up at Marvin. I don't think I heard revelry yet, Marv. Marvin shrugged. Get up anyway, you big lug. He grabbed his shower gear and headed for the door. Mac sat up, rubbed his head, and groggily said, Well, if you put it that way, how can I refuse? Marvin lifted his arm and waved his hand once in parting to his flying partner and friend. Then he headed to the bathhouse to shower and shave. A while later, as he looked in the mirror and positioned his head for the final swipes of the razor, he noticed that his hand was shaking. He rinsed the razor and splashed water on his face. Then he leaned in close to his reflection and stared into his own eyes. Just a few more missions, Marv, he told himself. You can do this. His reflection looked back at him with weary, doubtful eyes. You get to go home soon. You can see Bess. but you've got to hold it together a little longer. His personal pep talk was interrupted by the arrival of another airman who hesitated momentarily when he saw Marvin eyeball to eyeball with himself in the mirror. Marvin simply nodded at the man's reflection and watched him pass by to the showers. Returning his attention to himself, he said, "We've got this, don't we, buddy?" He waited a moment, and then his reflection slowly nodded in wary agreement. He stepped back and ran his hand over his cropped hair. "If only Bess could see me now," he said quietly so that the showering airman wouldn't hear him over the running water. Marvin swung by the mess hall for a quick breakfast on his way back to his barracks. There, Marvin slipped on his flight suit and then joined the other airmen for their mission briefing. By now, the briefing was fairly routine, as most of the men in his squadron had been part of Operation Linebacker since its inception 5 months earlier. But their commander always made sure to explain the day's objectives and answer any of their questions before sending them up. Marvin took a seat by Mac. He noticed the man's focus and admired that it never seemed to waver, despite the months of intensive bombing they'd been carrying out. Mac was a true soldier in Marvin's eyes, the kind that Marvin both wished he could be, but feared to become. He wanted to serve his country and do it proud, but he, like so many people back home, wasn't sure that this particular war was where he should be. And he definitely wasn't sure he wanted to go back up and drop more bombs on people who were, in essence, just like himself. People who simply wanted to live their lives in peace. Mac glanced over at him and frowned a little. He nudged Marvin's leg. "You okay?" Marvin nodded and feigned a cocky grin. "Never better. You?" Mac continued to frown at him for a minute. Then he winked at Marvin. "You know me, kid. Any day I get a fly is a good day to me." The commander wrapped things up and gestured for Mac to join him. Mac rose and thumped Marvin on the shoulder. "See you out there, kid." Marvin watched his pilot walk away and shook his head in bemusement and slight disgust. Kid? The nickname suited him, even though he was older than Mac. He felt like a kid who'd been sent to some strange camp that he hadn't quite figured out, even after all this time. He was glad his second tour was about over. He needed to go home so that he could feel like a man without feeling guilty about it. Lately, he'd spent a lot of time with a local woman, time that was meant to make him forget what he was doing here and simulate the place he most wanted to be, in Bess's arms. However, the effects of this place were messing with his mind and his heart. He just wanted his tour to end so he could go back to his normal life with his beautiful wife. Another large pothole in the road caused the truck to jolt roughly and Marvin's head to bounce soundly off and back onto the floorboards. Even though his thoughts had been miles away with Bess only moments ago, his first thoughts now were of the local woman he'd come to know well during his time off base. How could he ever get word to her of his capture? Who would tell her if he were executed or tortured to death? A small sob escaped his lips, and the nearest captor awarded him with a firm kick to the head, followed by some words that Marvin took to mean, "Shut the F up." He squelched his fears the best he could and tried to look around the truck bed, but the same captor threw a jacket over his head and delivered an even harder blow to Marvin's already throbbing skull. Fortunately, the jacket absorbed the worst of the kick, but it was still severe enough to send him back into a welcome state of unconsciousness. That was chapter 3 of Ticker Tape. I hope you enjoyed it.